Happy to be here this morning, and I'm very pleased to be sitting here with two such distinguished gentlemen in their field. We are going to talk to you for about 45 minutes about the future of personal connections, which is quite interesting given that we all are being told almost daily that the world of connection is changing to the point where year by year we won't recognize what will be going on 5 years from now. So I'm a little bit old-fashioned, I suppose, because one of the things that I believe we should always remind ourselves as we're talking about how to communicate with the public, and we're dealing with the internet, and we're dealing with PDAs and mobile devices. I think one of the things that when we talk about personal connections, we need to remind ourselves to be cautious about gadgets. And when I say be cautious about gadgets, one of the things that concerns me going forward about the future of advertising and to some extent public relations is that a great deal of our strategy is now being focused on exactly how to communicate with people through these gadgets. And there's no question it's a part of the future. There's no question it should be part of our strategy. But I think at the same time, we have to always remember that on the other side of the gadget or on the other side of the newspaper or the radio or the television or whatever medium, there is a human being that ultimately it's our responsibility to do a good job of communicating with. And so when we look at this, it's interesting because the two gentlemen on the panel with me are in a great position to talk to you about the science of the personal connections and then also about the application of the science. And I think it's in the application of the science where caution is a part of what I believe should be our guiding post going forward. So I'll start with, as the moderator, I'll start by asking Dr. Peter Zanden, who heads up our global research practice group called Research and Data Insights at Hill & Knowlton. In addition to that, Peter is a vice chairman of the firm. He is a distinguished person in the field of research, having founded a company called IntelliQuest, which he later took public. He then sold to WPP, and his role at Hill & Knowlton began with our sister company, Public Strategies, over 10 years ago, where he developed a global research practice, which he still heads now at Hill & Knowlton. So, Peter, I'll start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, what I've got to do for about 5 or 10 minutes at the most is I want to talk you through some of the big trends that I see emerging. And these are the mega trends that I think when you start looking at personal connections, if you have that kind of context, it's much easier to understand maybe where the world is going. And how many of you have read Kurzweil? Are you familiar with him? If you're not, you should be. I think he's one of the best futurists out there. And he's actually an entrepreneur and a scientist, and he's very, very grounded. And he's written some wonderful books about where we're going. And again, they're grounded. So I don't think he's just a futurist who's looking into the clouds. He's actually very science-based. And he's made this prediction. And it's a very, very powerful prediction, which is by the 2030s, non-biological portion of our intelligence will predominate, which means our smartphones are going to be much more connected, much smarter than they are now, and they will be driving how we operate, and probably be driving us much more so than today. And his theory is that, we've seen an awful lot of change. I was fortunate enough to get involved in the computer industry back in the early 80s, and before even computers were connected, and the transformation obviously has been huge. What he sees is that change accelerating, and that's his big theory, is that Moore's law has been applied to technology. It needs to be applied to sciences, whether that's biotech, nanotech, and all that is merging into creating a very different world. So if you think things have changed and have sped up over the past decade, we really haven't seen much of anything. And again, if you want to understand point B, and that's what I always like to know, is where we are now and where we're going. This is really, I strongly recommend Kurzweil's book. Then also another big trend out there, and I imagine most of you have heard of behavioral economics, which this gentleman, Kahneman, has won a Nobel Prize for. And he's applied, in this book, again, it's relatively new, Thinking Slow and Fast and Slow. And what he talks about is how we make decisions, everything from instinctual to thoughtful decisions. And he basically shows all of our flawed decision-making when we use what he calls System 1, which is intuitive. And he talks about how that is appropriate, and very often it works, but very often it is not. And this thinking slow is when you start applying big data and analytics to it, you get much, much smarter. And I think a really good example was the Ogilvy speech that you just heard before this one, is that we're getting so much smarter about how the brain works, how we process information. Again, something very relevant to PR. And then finally on this trend, I've been getting more and more involved and interested in this linguistics analysis. Has anyone read Pennebaker's book? What he started doing, he's a professor at the University of Texas, and he started looking at people's use of language, actual words, and then being able to predict whether or not they're telling the truth or lying or they're going to be persuasive. It's just emerging, but again, a huge impact on our industry. What's interesting, he found, like for example, that people who use the word I are less likely to be lying. And so you start thinking about how we've always been trained to use the we word and everything else, and what he's learning are things like what people actually hear and what's a predictable, can you take a look at a politician or a business person and put them through this process and find out if they're confident, they're telling the truth. And so again, I think a major trend. And then also, I'm sure all of you are paying attention to these emerging technologies. And everything from quantified self, how many are you familiar with that movement? How many you know your Clout score? Just a few. Well, Clout, by the way, has given you all a number which measures your influence. And again, very, very primitive, but it picks up everything on the web and decides how important you are. So you have a Clout score whether you like it or not. But again, I think all of you are very much aware, or at least, seen these emerging technologies, and they're going to be huge. They're just starting. It's a very crowded space. There's a bubble, it'll pop and they'll, drop, but ultimately, these technologies are going to know us like we've never known ourselves before. And then finally, just again on this trend, and I imagine most of you get this, but let me try and do a good job of articulating it. Over the past 30, 40 years, Drucker came up with this concept of the knowledge worker. And that's really what people were paying for, is your knowledge. What do you know? Well, there's now this emerging trend, which is just as powerful, but maybe ultimately for the rest of our lifetimes will be more powerful. And that's basically we're moving into a social economy. Because what you need to know is available on your smartphones. It's available in databases. So that expertise of knowledge is not going to be as important as your social knowledge and knowing how politics work, knowing emotional intelligence, all those softer factors, which actually are the sweet spot for our industry. Yep. So I think this actually bodes very well for us if we can take advantage of it, because we are moving into a new economy. It is going to be social connections. It's going to be how well you know and can operate with other folks. So I think that's just a starting point. I'll turn it back over to Jack and Stephen.
So Peter, the world you're describing, where does wisdom come into this?
I think for the foreseeable future, because this is emerging, it's like the presentation before. I was real curious about how our brains work, but it's so far removed from my day-to-day experience. I'm looking at those charts and the patterns and everything else. I can't apply it. So I think for the foreseeable future, and by that mean 5, 10, 20 years, there is more and more of a premium applied to wisdom. And wisdom is really based very much on experience and knowledge and having that intuitive understanding of what a situation has.
So, Stephen, you've been the head of all things public for Singapore Airlines, and you now work for one of the most prestigious financial platforms in the world. You are in a position to know the application of all of this and how you might bottle this and put it on a shelf and actually use some of it in your everyday world. So talk to us about the personal communication from your vantage point as the all things public person in a global company.
Thanks, Jack. Good morning, everyone. I think the question that Jack just asked then about wisdom is something that is really, really important for people in our business. It's, if you like, taking the sort of stuff that Peter has talked to us about, the research, the psychology of what communications is about, and putting it into practice on a daily basis to help the brand and reputation of the companies we represent, or for the agency folk among us, for your clients. And I think there's a couple of things that I want to emphasize about personal connections that I think have been a little lost in the way we now do PR, if you like. One of the problems, one of the challenges we face is exactly what Jack just talked about, the proliferation of gadgetry. And when he talked about that, you might have seen I emptied my pockets of 3 different mobile devices. I've got another 3 up in my room. You know, for a time I worked for a technology company, so it's not surprising I've just got all of these things. Unfortunately, we've come to rely so much more on interacting with people via gadgets. The number of journalists now who send their questions by email because that's just the expectation that the companies and the agencies have. Journalists are actually losing the ability to interact with us. We, in turn, focus then on the questions on our email. Answer to question 1, answer to question 2. We've lost the art of developing key messages. We've lost the art of storytelling. And storytelling is our business. And I think we all need to take a little bit of time and get back to becoming great storytellers. I see my role in the company I work for now, in the companies I've worked for in the past, in a life in Australia working in politics. I am a storyteller. There's a lot of other things I have to do. I have to manage people, I have to manage issues and so on. But at my core, what satisfies me most is when I'm telling stories. And we should never lose sight of that. As comms people, I think one of the questions we should be asking ourselves, particularly those of us in this room who are at a senior level in our function, what are we doing to make sure that in 10 years, the person sitting in your chair in this conference is better equipped to do your job than you are? The whole issue of generating and nurturing the next generation of talent is very important. And I asked Lord Chadlington last night, what do we do to make sure that we inculcate a sense of ethical behaviour in the next generation? I'm a passionate believer in making sure that every one of us has, as part of our unwritten job description, nurturing the next leaders of our function, nurturing the next generation of talent. I think to do that, we need to understand our own businesses. We need to go deep, and we need to be prepared to engage not just with the media, but with our customers. When I was at Singapore Airlines, a terrific brand to represent, and my job was mostly to go out and talk to the media. But I consciously made an effort to go out and talk to customers regularly to hear what we were doing that annoyed them, what we could have improved, how they thought about our brand. Because at the end of the day, we are a customer, or we were, as I was then, a customer-facing brand. And if as a communications person, you aren't prepared to engage with your customers, then you don't really know your business well enough. I don't think we should have a mind fixed on hiring new talent for communications from graduates, among graduates from communications disciplines. One of my best hires at Singapore Airlines was a school teacher. When you think about it, a school teacher has to stand in front of a group of 30 or 40 children every single day and communicate. So there are inherent disciplines that I think are good to look beyond, because we tend to get very wrapped up in our own academic research. What we've heard from a couple of presentations yesterday and today, and I think one thing that Peter emphasised to us this morning, is how the conscious mind works. The last presentation, a couple of takeouts I took, keep things simple. Don't try and spin yourself too much. The more spin, the more people turn off. It might excite you thinking, wow, I spun our way out of that. Actually, your credibility doesn't benefit from that. Calling things as they are. Don't use jargon. You know, so these are the basics that I think we need to remind ourselves of, because as I say, I think we've lost that ability to be great storytellers. We've lost that personal connection that we used to have with our audience. And let's also keep in mind, our audience are not the media. Our audience are not journalists. Our audience are the people that watch, read, and listen to those journalists. The journalists are a channel, are a conduit. And it's exactly the same with social media. Social media is another channel that reaches the ultimate audience, particularly for consumer-facing businesses, the people that decide, do I or do I not buy your product? Do I or do I not trust your brand and reputation? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'd like to ask both of you if what we're dealing with is the topic struggling between the impersonal and the personal. I believe that all of us in the PR business at least are witnessing literally a new highway to the public, and our struggles are to form organizations that fit that new highway. So if we're dealing with 80% of the methods of communications are the types of things, Peter, that you talked about, what's that going to do to the industry in terms of the workforce, the people we hire in public relations? You know, 30, 40 years ago, if you got a job in the PR business, there was somebody down the hall who'd been doing it 20 years and you were said to be an apprentice, or you had to study, and there was some art apparently to calling a reporter. So today, the people that we're hiring, as you say, from a wider variety of education and background, they understand much more about the world we're talking about, the methods of communication, than all of us that are the so-called leaders of the industry or the firms. So what's this going to do long-term to the workforce?
Look, without wishing to sound like I'm just coming back to a key message, but after all, we should be getting good at delivering our key messages. It's all about storytelling. It's you know, do you have the people that are coming through the pipeline of talent who are going to be able to be effective, creative storytellers that can use their imagination to tell a story about an organisation? You know, if I think back to Singapore Airlines, you know, Singapore Airlines does a lot of things really, really well. But if I asked an engineer to tell that story, it's going to be very different to the way the public would want to hear it. So, you know, the people that we need to be looking for, the talent that we need to look for, are the people who can apply the lens through which the public would be interested to see the story, and that it elicits some emotional response, because that after all is going to be the call to action, the buy trigger or the trust trigger will be related to some emotive appeal.
So Peter, you've served as a professor in one of the nation's leading business schools. You see this every day. What do you think this says about the type of employee that we'll be looking at in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm relatively new to the PR industry. I've worked as much with strategy consultants, and I've also worked with marketing consultants and certainly with ad agencies. So I've been able to see that whole spectrum. of services applied to companies. And it's interesting. I actually think the PR industry potentially is in the sweet spot, but it's going to have to add 2 new skill sets, if not 3, to what it's already done. One, obviously, the domain expertise is what we do, which is communications. But as I was saying, I think the fluency of technology, if we don't grab it, certainly digital agencies will, if not advertising agencies. So I think, number one, you need to make sure whether you're a new recruit or someone who's got 20 years experience, you need to tune into the technology. And the third piece, which I'm a bit biased about, but I've seen it emerge more and more so in the PR industry. When I first started doing it, everyone just wanted to get press. Now everyone wants to be measured and be accountable. And so I think that measurement and research is extremely important. And I think it's not you go to the outside group and be measured. I actually think PR professionals need to have that as part of their DNA. So I think our jobs got much more complex, but I think if we can take those 3 domains, that we will be in the sweet spot in this new communications environment.
Jack, can I just respond? I think Peter makes a really good point there. But one of the things that struck me is when you said, I'm new to this PR stuff, and you come from a background in strategy. Actually, I think that's a core component that good communications leaders need to bring to their business. That what I talked about earlier is going deep on the business. That means the ability to sit at the top table and be involved in those value-adding strategy discussions about the business. If you just look at, my job is to write the press release when it's been decided by the head table, then in my view, you're not adding the value that a communications leader needs to. So I think that's a very important point.
And Jack, I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts on your concept of the 5th seat.
Well, about 10 years ago, I was struggling with a way to describe what we were doing, actually. And so one of the things I observed was that in most of our clients, at the top level of the company, they automatically, instinctively would hire a law firm, accounting firm, management consultants, and bankers. There would automatically be 3 or 4 people in the room, and they always seem to get around to calling all of us after the decision's been made, sometimes a week after it's appeared to be a bad decision. And so I coined this phrase, the 5th seat. And the 5th seat is intended to say that those of us in this business, that we think there's a need to elevate the idea of analyzing, strategizing about, and measuring the public, and that it needs to be given the same level of importance in any company that the other 4 seats have. The challenge to that is that that seat is a place where you coordinate all things public. That sometimes goes against the organizational chart of the client because they've still got things siloed. It also has more pressure because of what we're talking about, this notion of the impersonal world and the technology now that's overtaking the way we communicate with the public will place an even greater emphasis inside the room on not only the 5th seat, but in understanding these new methods of communication. So, Stephen, I actually have a question for you, and that has to do with, you're in a business, we've all experienced the sector. There's oftentimes the notion that the people that your company's dealing with may only represent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% of the population, as opposed to Singapore Airline, where it was a broader base.
Yeah.
So what you'll hear oftentimes in a large company that has the platform you do is, why would I bother to have a public campaign, public need, anything public, when 95% of the population will never come in contact with us?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. That looks at it through the lens that probably a marketing person would look at it from.
Right.
One of the important factors that I see people like us doing is we are the guardians and advocates of reputation. And reputation affects more than just sales. It affects what people think and believe. It's that very emotive, very intangible view. So for an investment company, it's whether you're seen as a desirable investor, whether people want to bring you in, and the price that you come in at. For a technology company, it's the advocacy that people will have for your products. For an airline, particularly an airline like Singapore Airlines, the airline only carries 18 million passengers a year. It operates as many flights to the US in a week as United Airlines operates in 2 minutes nationwide. So there's a huge aspirational base there that I don't think we should ever lose sight of. That you know, there's no such thing as a market that has matured to the point where it can't possibly grow.
Thank you. Peter, anything else to add?
Again, I just reinforcement of moving into this social economy, that we're not going to be looking at people for their expertise. We're going to be looking at them to, you know, what they know, who they know. Who they know is going to become more important than ever before. Yeah. And it's interesting, as you have all the science and everything else, I think those relationships and your social relationships and your social knowledge is going to be a premium. And that's where a lot of the wisdom is going to reside for our industry, is within that social economy.
So I want to close by thanking you for allowing us to be here today and for coming to our session. It has been our great pleasure. It is an honor to be at anything associated with Paul Holmes, and he's somebody in the industry that is always our advocate as a business, and it helps all of us to be associated with Paul. So thank you very much for having us today.
We have time for questions from the floor, please.
Okay. Can you turn the lights up so we can see who's asking the questions? The person who's read more books than anybody in the room has a question. Got it.
I'd just like to, thank you very much for the panel. I would just like to hear you answer your own question, Jack, about what's the role of wisdom.
Well, I think in the PR business, particularly the larger firms, which I had one, we have to make sure that we're chasing the 21st century, we're chasing gadgets, we're chasing new ways of communicating. I heard one of my colleagues the other day at another forum say that they'd started a whole division called storytelling. I think, though, that what's also important is from a standpoint of the advice we're giving clients, it has to also be wisdom-based, based on experience, based on prior example, and based on data. And I think that we all aspire to that, but I think we have to always keep in mind that somebody actually said it earlier, that ultimately what we're doing is talking to a client about their relationship with the public. And we ought not lose sight of the fact that that's the primary thing. Yep. And I think that requires wisdom.
Can I just add to that, Jack? Something that concerns me is when I hear that an agency has to set up a division about storytelling. I think it means that the fundamental skill of storytelling, which should be present in everyone in our industry, it validates my concern that we've sidelined that skill.
Right.
We've gone for more academic and theoretical skills. We've gone for the ability to turn emails around, do presentation decks that wow the client, but actually we've lost that art.
Well, and let me quickly say that the agency I heard say that is an excellent agency.
I'm sure.
Does great work.
I don't know who it is, but I'm sure
I felt 100 years old when I heard them talking about the storytelling division of their company, because I grew up in Texas and that's all we did was tell stories.
Still is, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Somebody that's supposedly new to PR, but not particularly new to storytelling. I was a journalist for 10 or 15 years before I started at the Good Relations Group in London in January. Peter, I wanted to talk to you about something you said. Something I recognised during a career in journalism was moving from the art of being able to ask questions and hear questions answered and ask supplementary questions and genuinely engage with somebody, either on the phone or in person, to the point where I was an editor trying to persuade young reporters not to succumb to the request to email questions and have paragraphs of copy, carefully checked copies sent back. You're talking about us losing the art of storytelling. Jack just mentioned where conversations and stories are now less frequent than us having to write a one-page or a deck, presentation deck, to get a point across in meetings or to bosses. What, with the evolving technology over time, what is your best tip for us pushing back on this and working against it to make sure that we don't lose those skills and to make sure that those around us accept the importance of genuinely engaging in a personal relationship? Right.
Very complex question.
Really long, sorry.
No, but I get it, because the issue is you know, there is an emerging approach to telling stories, and it's not the old approach. It is a new approach where it's more driven by data and, you know, email, and you know, there's not as much texture to it. So I think it's, to me, it's clear that over the next 10, 20 years, that technology will do a much better job of telling those stories. I mean, there's an opportunity out there that all these companies are pursuing of how do you understand someone, how do you tell a story technologically? We're not there yet. So short-term, technology is not the solution. Short-term, you know, it really, you have to keep pushing back, and that's, you know, my experience when working with clients is you have, or younger folks, you have to push back and say, how do you know that? Did you only look at the computer? Did you go to the store? Did you buy their product? Did you go get that, you know, that true human interaction? Because it is easy, it's almost a default to just stare at your computer screen or, you know, do a Google search or something like that. So I think it's, you know, part mentoring, and then part, I really like the door Jack comes through, which is ask people about the wisdom, where they get their wisdom. Because right now, I don't think there's much wisdom on the internet. There's a lot of wisdom in, as Stephen was saying, talking to people, getting your hands dirty, kicking tires, and then I think you do naturally tell the story if you have that experience. But I'm relatively optimistic that, you know, it's decades out, but sooner or later, this technology is going to be able to tell stories and provide so much texture, and probably make humans a little less relevant to how the economy works, which is that whole Kurzweil. He's basically saying that, you know, hey, somewhere out there, these computers are going to run this planet much better than we do.
I'll just make one brief comment to that. I think third-party advocacy is something that's very important. Having people tell your story for you is always better than telling it yourself. And that's something that can only come through personal connection. You know, I equate it to people like this. If I'm at a dinner party and I sit at the table and I say, you know, that Stephen Forshaw, he's a really cool guy, everyone else at the table would just go, what a wacko. But if I'm at the table and I sit there and say, hey, that Jack Martin, he's really impressive, then
they'll say he's a wacko.
Then, you know, that's the power of third-party advocacy. People start believing it. Again, it's just as important as storytelling. We can't lose sight of it.
So from one of the digital natives in the crowd, I'm going to push back for a second, but you just mentioned there's not a lot of wisdom on the internet. And one area that's getting a lot of publicity recently is social analytics, right? So you mentioned the new social economy and you mentioned data in separate points. And one thing social analytics allows us to do now is to start to tap into, and a lot of your business is around understanding public audiences, so start to tap into audiences that exist on social networks, and increasingly my generation is increasingly comfortable sharing tons and tons and tons of personal information as well as, you know, product and business information and their sentiment. So how do you think that is going, where do you think we are in that being an effective kind of tool to measure and analyze an audience and, you know, effectively then talk back to them or talk with them? And where do you think it's going? I mean, IBM is basically, some of their national advertising now is around how they're implementing social analytics to affect, business change. So I'm curious, as communicators, how you think that's going to play out.
It may be a commentary on what Peter's doing on the internet.
Yeah, let me start with the future is yours, but we're not in the future just yet. And my experience in working with clients, that if you just bring social analytics to them, there's still too much noise. It's really hard to get through it. So a very specific example is a client of ours had someone talking about them on 60 Minutes. And we understood 10 million people watched that interview. Meanwhile, we went to Twitter feeds and everything else and tried to understand the ramifications of that conversation. And there were hundreds of tweets about it. I mean, so if you go look at that world right now, and it was loud when you look at those tweets or those postings or the blogosphere. But when you actually step back and go, well, what's the public hearing? They heard it millions of times. So I think there's that balance, and there's probably some pockets where, the profession is emerging. Again, I am very optimistic that social analytics will capture the conversation. But I still think it's early, and I think it actually can be very misleading for a lot of clients who put too much weight that that's where the world is, because it's not there yet.
I'd just say really briefly on that there's the need to engage and tell stories in the social media space as well. When I was at Singapore Airlines, I would regularly jump in on discussion threads and forums where people are talking about us. In fact, on one where I jumped in where we were being attacked for something or other, the number of people that responded, that's not really him. He wouldn't be jumping in on a Sunday. It's probably an imposter. But you're going to get all of that. The internet brings out both the best and the worst in people, but at the end of the day, you're quite right. There's a wealth of information out there. It depends on how you want to listen to it, but more importantly, I think you've also got to engage in the dialogue. It's not a case of a monologue from my Facebook or Twitter feed. It's the willingness to have the conversation, and that all comes back to, dare I say it, storytelling.
Well, I think, I'll just close by saying, I think you're the future. A digital firm is the future. I mean, it's what we're dealing with today, for any of us older, larger firms to have a digital group is probably the equivalent of an advertising agency 80 years ago having a TV division.
Yeah.
So I think that we're all sort of grasping with how to deal with this, and I think all firms are ultimately going to be digital firms, and those of you that are out on the cutting edge of it are really the future, as opposed to the panel of at least 2 buggy whip salesmen sitting up here today.
He was very clever there. 2 out of 3, but doesn't tell us who.
Yeah. Okay, did I see somebody telling us it's time? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you very much. We've enjoyed being here. Thank you.